Well, the Bondsman might use a lot of Christian lingo, but it has some pretty weird ideas about demons in hell that are sadly familiar and worn out. But can the rest of the show make up for it? I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. The IMDb synopsis for The Bondsman reads, resurrected bounty hunter Hub Halloran gets an unexpected second chance at life, love, and his nearly forgotten musical career, only to find that his old job now has a demonic new twist. So, yeah, he gets killed at the beginning of the first episode. He is a bounty hunter by trade, and this is all in the trailer for the show. And then he's revived and told, okay, now you're a bounty hunter for hell, to go and get the demons that have escaped from hell and bring them back to hell. And this job lasts as long as you survive doing it. And if you fail to carry out the pursuit or a contract or whatever, then you will be killed. So you're either going to be killed by a demon or you're going to be killed by, I guess, the powers of hell if you fail in your job. And he's got a dysfunctional relationship with various family members that in this sort of second chance, temporary though it may be, the series is focused on him trying to rebuild, trying to repair some of these relationships and to reflect on his life and choices in different ways. So it's that kind of story mixed in with one demon per episode that he's got to hunt down and stop. The episodes, there are 8 this season, and they're fairly tight, and they're only about 30 minutes each, which I found a little bit surprising. I just watched the first 3 episodes. I would describe this as not full-on comedy, but it's sort of it's a blend of comedy, horror, spurts of action, but the horror itself is kept fairly frivolous. There are some kind of like intense beats, but I would say in general, it doesn't seem like it's trying to scare me. Each episode gives more details about Hub's personal and relational dysfunctions, starting with his mom, his ex-wife, his son, and there's a reveal at the end of episode 3 that teases a pretty big crime he committed in the past. And up through the first 3 episodes, we're still wondering as an audience, okay, what was the sin that sent him to hell? Because that's how they're treating the lore, that it has nothing to do with his relationship with God. Does he have right standing with God provided to him by the sacrifice of Jesus? None of that. It's like, what's the big sin that you did that sent you to hell? Which is the popular way of thinking about hell, even in a Christian-influenced culture. Unfortunately, the actual biblical ideas of hell and why people end up there have just not transmitted into the way fiction handles it, even when it's ostensibly inspired by Christian ideas. So what does it feel like, though, to me, to watch this show? Well, like I said, it doesn't seem interested in scaring me. I never really felt scared. It's not really funny, but I suppose your mileage will vary. I do have kind of a narrow sense of humor. It's not quite dramatically weighty either. I would describe it as interesting at best. I'll just now and then I'm interested in watching and I think, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. But I'm not really engaged with the characters. I'm not really invested in them. And this is the biggest problem for me. It doesn't lean hard enough into any one of the things that it's kind of putting into the mix. The demons seem to easily butcher anyone with this sort of telekinetic body twisting or impaling. They can attack them physically with the human bodies that they possess. And there is one interesting concept that I'll give them, that the demons in this show, they only possess people after killing them. And the reason given is that that's how they avoid any exorcisms. And I'm like, okay, well, that makes sense. I mean, you got to have a show. If you're going to have a show about a guy hunting demons the way he would hunt humans as a bounty hunter, then you've got to explain, well, why don't we just do some kind of an exorcism or prayer or something like that? Why aren't we not approaching this spiritually instead of just gunning them down or whatever he has to do to kill them? So that kind of explains that. So that's maybe a somewhat novel approach. At least they explain that way why exorcisms are not in the picture. But these demons, they inhabit human corpses, basically, and they can attack just using their corpse's body. or they have telekinetic powers to throw things at people or to lift them up and contort and twist and break their body in horrific ways, which happens in the first episode. But they don't use the most brutal moves that they have that quickly kill people on Hub, on the main character, on the biggest threat to them. And I'm like, why aren't you doing that? So once I noticed that, and it didn't take long to notice that, all the tension in the climax is gone. I'm like, he's just surviving because he's a main character with plot armor. There is no reason that he should be doing any better than anyone else when you're up against a demon that apparently with a thought can lift you up into the air and break all your bones and drop you like a sack of bleh. So yeah, the climaxes, no tension in them for me. Hell and its lore are treated vaguely and lightly enough that the threat of Hub going back there doesn't feel serious or likely. So that's a problem too. I don't really feel like, man, he's got to do this job right. He's got to, figure out how to keep surviving, because if he doesn't, he'll go back to hell. Well, we never see hell. We just find out that he's been there. He doesn't remember being there. He just died, came back, and stuff like that. So there's no sense of dread of like, oh my gosh, he really, really needs to avoid that. The only sense of like avoidance that I might feel is what I guess I would bring with me about my understanding of hell. But my understanding of hell, clearly very different from what they came up with here, as is so often the case. The family drama, I would say, comes closest to having some weight. There are some moments here and there where they kind of settle into an argument or something like that and give it a little bit of time. But I think the episodes are ultimately too short and too tightly paced to give those scenes the breathing room I need to sit in the weight of them and really feel that. As far as the cast goes, I think they're all fine. Kevin Bacon is in the lead on this one. No one really gets a chance to drive a scene with performance. Again, that's because of the pacing. And neither do I think anyone is given material to really convincingly emote with, or at least in a diverse way. It's mostly people being angry and bickering, and in a somewhat overstated way that sacrifices my investment in character and believability at their bickering and anger and stuff at the altar of a sort of halfway committed to humor. So yeah, the performances are fine, but they just don't get the opportunities that I want them to have to really help me invest. As far as stunts and visuals, there's definitely some CG, and it's the kind of like CG you would expect in supernatural shows, supernatural kind of smokiness, I guess, or like a weird haze and effects around people's glowing eyes. There are some infrequent yet brutal and sometimes shocking instances of gore that at least in those moments early on helped establish the threat. I was like, oh my gosh, holy crap. But like I said earlier, the script does not explain why these demons don't get equally brutal with Hub. If they've got that trick up their sleeve, that should be their go-to every single time. Or as soon as they sense any resistance from Hub, any challenge from Hub, okay, I should do the body-twisting telekinesis thing. Anyway, so as far as themes, is there anything more of moral, philosophical, spiritual significance that could trigger some worthwhile thought or conversation? Yeah, I mean, of course, with the backdrop of all the supernatural stuff, I think that a Christian that has some basic knowledge of what the Bible teaches about hell, about demons, is going to observe pretty quickly, okay, this doesn't line up, and stuff like that. And I'm not going to wag my finger at them for this, because I'm not in the business of judging Christians. Paul was not in the business of wagging his finger at non-Christians. It's those in the church that we're supposed to be correcting. So, I'm not expecting anything from them in that regard. But I'll go over some of these that make me kind of interested in, like, okay, well, what is their perspective? Kind of an agent representing hell tells Hub that, as far as bounty hunters, who we get for this job, we're not that picky. She says the last one wasn't even Christian. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. What does that sentence mean? Wasn't even Christian. So does that mean that Christianity in the lore of this show is closer to the truth? But it still ultimately doesn't matter that the person being the bounty hunter is a Christian? And then on top of that, okay, Christian, does that mean that Hub is being viewed as a Christian? Well, he clearly grew up in a culturally Christian environment. His mom doesn't seem to be, who's a major character that's with him a lot. She seems committed to it culturally, but like her knowledge of the Bible really seems pretty sparse. But then there's also the question of, okay, so if we accept this lore as it is, does that mean Christians can go to hell? Well, I doubt they're thinking all this through very much. But like from my perspective, if I were to try to help them out and figure out some headcanon in which this would make sense, well, the term Christian is a term that came up, was not invented by Christians. It was actually invented, if memory serves, by those those outside of the church as, I think, kind of like an insult. And really, it's more of a cultural identifier than a spiritual status. When I talk about quote unquote Christians, when I'm talking about like their condition, their spiritual condition, I usually like to use the term believer, because Christian, a lot of people can be culturally Christian, can identify as Christians, but it really doesn't sink in. It's not something that they actually believe. They just maybe appreciate the morality of certain teachings in the Bible, and they go to church and whatever. But so that's interesting. I guess there could be a sense in which a Christian could end up in hell if that's the definition, if it's a cultural identifier rather than identifying their spiritual status. Then there's this idea of demons breaking out of hell. Well, hell is made for demons, but we see that in the book of Revelation, they're really not going into the lake of fire until the final judgment. And right now, there's a different place that they go that's referred to as Hades or Sheol Hades. But that raises the question, okay, if God made these places for the demons to be held, then if they can break out, what does that say about God? So it's, certainly leaves room for there to be this flawed idea of God, or a limited idea of God's ability, his awareness, his power. To that point, God is rarely mentioned in this show. And that's always the big question when I see shows with this kind of premise, where they're dealing with like the Satan, devil, demons, hell side of things. And I'm like, where's God? Where's God in any of this? Let's see here. There's a pastor character who we discover in episode 2 is privately an extremely vain person. There's a gag even where he's like fixing his hair and he uses some holy water to kind of like slick it back, and then says to himself, looking in the mirror, hallelujah, So he's like vain and disrespectful of God's holiness to the point of mockery. I don't particularly believe in the concept of holy water, but he does, or someone in his position should see this as sanctified water set apart for the very specific holy purposes of God, and yet he's using it in a very flippant way. That is to be expected, unfortunately, in a lot of fiction for those in authority in a Christian type of church to be very hypocritical and stuff like that. So again, that was another point that's like, yeah, this feels a bit tired. There's an interesting conversation between Hub and his mom, because he's sharing this stuff with her. And I think in part, she's kind of having her faith come to life in a real way in front of her eyes. But at the same time, she's also trying to convince Hub to like, hey, wake up, Hub. I know you haven't really believed this. You really haven't been walking the walk like I've wanted you to. But this means, just think about this for a second. All of this stuff means the whole deal is real, including, she says, God. And that was like the first mention of God. And so I'm waiting to see, is God ever going to not show up as a character? I doubt they would ever do that. But I mean, are there I think going to be any angels, any kind of representatives of God? So what else? Oh, pride is suggested at one point as the sin that condemned Hub to hell. And I appreciated at least this being brought up, because I feel like pride is one of the least touched on sins in entertainment. And yet the entertainment world and all of us that are soaking in entertainment, we are so easily given to pride, to self-absorption, to just self-focus, and fragile egos, and worrying about what people think of us, or being defensive in a way that we're abrasive, that actually stems from something in our pride or insecurity and stuff like that. And there's definitely things like that happening in Hub's life. And so I appreciate them thematically just calling that out. What I'm interested in is what's going to be his path to quote-unquote redemption. I mean, it looks like they're going to follow the standard formula of, well, he needs to make right the wrongs of his past. He's got to restore his relationship with his son and with his ex-wife, even if they don't get married. He has to make peace, da-da-da-da-da. He has to show that he is giving up on some sins that were once part of his experience, stuff like that. Life change. Ultimately, so works, good deeds, good works, he's also, but that's unclear at this point as to what that's going to be. I just think that in terms of how these shows tend to go, that's probably where it's going to go. He's talking about looking for a loophole. There's got to be some loophole that'll mean that I don't have to ultimately go back to hell. And despite all the Christian lingo being used, I just can't imagine that loophole is going to be Jesus, who is not the loophole. He is the way. If you're pulling from Christian teaching, then Jesus is the provision, the sacrifice that provides us rescue and pardon freely, just for believing in him for that. And it's like it's right in front of them, and I'm like, yeah, but they're not going to go that route. So yeah, it's a theological mess, but like Paul in Acts chapter 17, is there some truth here that we can look at to say, you know what, that's right. That's worth highlighting. Well, I already mentioned that I appreciate the kind of spotlight on pride as a significant issue. I appreciate the family relationship struggles, even though they're more exaggerated versions of what I experience. I can still kind of relate to them and want to root for him to repair his relationships. I think there's probably going to be themes. I mean, there are already themes. They're setting them up about repairing the damage you've done and making changes to your life. These are, of course, good themes that we can agree with. Admitting your sin. I think we are in the early stages of him not admitting sin, but you can see in some scenes that Hub is like, when he's being confronted with something like his pride, there's moments where he'll be defensive and talk back, but other times where it's like he's just kind of staring in front of him and you're like, okay, he's at least processing this right now. And so I think him getting to the point where he can admit his sin, and just be humble about that. That could also be a thing that we could get on board with. All right. No idea what your tastes are in TV shows, but if I were a time traveler, I'd go back in time and say, Peter. Well, yeah, skip this one. It's not that it's bad in terms of just film quality, storytelling quality, just the overall package, apart from the theological stuff is obviously a mess. But the rest of it, it's not that it's bad, but it's no more than interesting at times. And there's always going to be something else you'll feel like watching more than this. So this one's rated 16 plus on Amazon Prime for violence, frightening scenes, smoking, and foul language. And those are all of my thoughts for now on The Bondsman, episodes 1 through 3. As always, I'd love to get your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Please like, share, subscribe, click that bell to stay connected. I want to thank the Spirit Blade Insiders for making so much of my content possible. You can get info about the benefits of joining at patreon.com/Spirit Productions. Then I hope you'll check out our podcast and stay connected to all CGC content at christiangeekcentral.com as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.